need in Wyre and Blackpool, as well as Fylde Borough. So any references in the report and the presentation to need in the wider area refer to the area encompassing Fylde, Blackpool and Wyre boroughs. One of the principal aims of national planning guidance in planning policy for traveller sites is to address traveller site provision. There's been a long-standing unmet need for additional sites in the wider area as a whole, despite policies aimed at increasing the provision of sites. The 2007 Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Assessment remains the best available source of information on need. It found a need for almost 28 pitches in the wider area up to 2016, a need for less than one pitch in Fylde, with 24 pitches in neighbouring Blackpool and 3 travelling showman sites in Wyre. The National Planning Policy Framework and the Guidance in Planning Policy for Traveller Sites don't limit the consideration of need to the district in which a site is located, and it's appropriate for the decision maker to ensure that all relevant aspects of need are taken into account, and the nomadic nature of gypsies and travellers is a factor in taking this approach. With regard to the decision at the Travellers' site at Fairfield Road near Poulton, the Secretary of State agreed with his inspector in that evidence of need in the wider area is a significant material consideration weighing in favour of the development of that site. Since the Fairfield Road decision, there have not been any planning permissions granted for additional gypsy and traveller sites in the Fylde, Blackpool and Wyre wider area. Consequently, it's considered that the need for additional pitches in the wider area remains a significant material consideration in favour of granting planning permission for this particular site. Criterion 1 of Policy HL8 requires the identified need for gypsy sites in the area. In view of the lack of an identified need for sites in Fylde Borough within the GTAA, the development can be considered to conflict with this requirement. Nevertheless, the evidence of a need in the wider area, albeit of less weight than if an identified need existed within Fylde Borough, is a material consideration weighing in favour of the proposal. Looking now at the issue of the previous use of the land and the lawful development certificate, a lawful use certificate for the use of this site as a builder's storage yard was granted in 2008. The legality of the Council's decision to grant the certificate has been raised as an issue by the Newton Residents Association. This matter has been thoroughly explored by your officers, and Council's advice has been obtained as to whether grounds exist to revoke this certificate. The advice is that there are no grounds to revoke it. The lawful use of the site is therefore for the storage of building contractors' materials. Even if the use of the land as a builder's yard was not lawful due to revocation of the lawful development certificate or abandonment of the use, this is a brownfield site which sits in the existing landscape. The site meets the same policy requirements whether it's considered as previously developed land or as having the benefit of a certificate of lawful use for storage of builders' materials. If evidence indicated that the use under the lawful development certificate had been abandoned, the site would still need to be considered as previously developed land. Looking now at sustainability, whilst the site would be regarded as having a low accessibility rating by public transport and cycling, it is situated within walking distance of a bus service, a convenience store, a primary school and a public house, which are all situated within Newton. Lancashire County Council have also confirmed that there are available places at the schools within the catchment area of the Thames Street site regarding primary schools and secondary schools. So whilst accessibility is one aspect of sustainability, the overall proposal is considered sustainable as within the policies of the National Planning Policy Framework. In terms of the impact on the settled community, the site is close to the defined boundary of the village of Newton. It measures a 16th of a hectare in size and is proposed to accommodate 4 traveller pitches. This represents a small increase in the number of households when compared to the existing settlement of Newton. So given that the proposal would be situated on brownfield land and would not dominate the nearest settlement, your officers consider it complies with the guidance contained in planning policy for traveller sites. There is no evidence that there would be an adverse impact on the settled community by the addition of 4 Gypsy traveller families at this site. With regard to the issue of the impact on the setting of a listed building, the boundary of the site is situated 53 metres from Dagger Cottage, a Grade 2 listed dwelling on Grange Lane. The garden, which forms part of the curtilage of the listed building, is immediately on the boundary of the development site. There are a significant number of mature trees between the site and the listed building. Your officers have assessed the significance of the setting of the listed building in relation to the development site as required by the appropriate tests in paragraph 129 of the framework. The listing description has been considered and the view of the Council's regeneration manager have been taken into account, as has the guidance published by English Heritage. The former Planning Policy Statement 5, Planning for the Historic Environment, defined the setting of a heritage asset as the surroundings in which the asset is experienced. From this definition, it can be understood that setting embraces all of the surroundings from which the heritage asset can be experienced, or that can be experienced from or with the asset. It is your officer's opinion, following the English Heritage Assessment Procedure with regard to setting as outlined on page 27 of the committee report, that the proposed caravan site development will not affect the setting of the listed building or any of the special characteristics of the listed building as set out in the listing description. This assessment is based on the separation distance, the topographical relationship and the landscaping and screening in between the site and Dagger Cottage. The interrelationship between Dagger Cottage and the directly adjacent Dixon's farmhouse, which is also a Grade 2 listed building, would not be affected by the proposed development. Furthermore, both Dagger Cottage and Dixon's farmhouse are primarily appreciated from Grange Lane, the primary elevations of each of these buildings. Looking now at the highways issue, the application originally proposed 2 caravans per pitch, of which not more than 1 would be a static mobile home. Lancashire County Council, as Highway Authority, originally requested the submission of swept path modelling diagrams in order to ascertain whether the caravans could access the site. During a meeting, and I've shown you the photographs, the applicant towed a touring caravan onto the site, and these photographs of the caravan accessing the site and being towed along Thames Street, along with the highways report prepared by Sanderson's as an objection, have been considered by the County Highway Authority. The applicant has indicated that he would be willing to accept a planning condition restricting the proposal to 2 touring caravans per family only, which would mean static caravans are no longer proposed. On Friday, we received a further consultation response from the Highway Authority with concerns regard to surfacing and lighting, which states, in view of these concerns, the Highways Officer feels that it would be inappropriate to grant planning permission. However, should you be mindful to grant planning permission, they request conditions be imposed. On Monday of this week, we received a further response from the Highways Department stating we see no highway grounds for objection relating to the issues covered by the conditions, which are risk of loose material in the highway, safe access junction, lighting and safe walking surfaces in Thames Street, and delivery of these improvements before occupation. Therefore, the Highways Authority is saying they would not wish to see it become a highways reason for refusal and would not wish to defend it at an appeal process. The neighbouring land uses include a poultry farm and an equestrian use, which generate their own vehicular movements. The frequency of towed caravan movements is likely to be low, and the proportions of a towed caravan would not be dissimilar to other types of vehicles which use Thames Street. Therefore, it is not considered that a highways objection can be sustained, as the proposed development would only have a limited impact on highway safety, subject to the conditions restricting the caravans to a size which are capable of being towed on the public highway, and the off-site highway works conditions which are recommended by the Highway Authority and are included as conditions 13 and 14 on your late observation list. In terms of visual amenity, yes, there will be some impact from caravans, particularly when viewed from the rear of houses in Grange Lane, which are situated at a higher level than the development site. But bearing in mind the current appearance of this brownfield site, when seen in conjunction with a substantial group of agricultural buildings beyond the site, and the current level of landscaping provision, then the overall impact is likely to be limited. Given the location of the site between existing agricultural buildings and the edge of the village of Newton, it's considered that any impact on visual amenity would be of an acceptable level. Turning now to flood risk, the application boundary is wholly within flood zone 1, which is defined as having a low probability of flooding. As the site is less than 1 hectare, the guidance does not require a flood risk assessment to be submitted by the applicant. The Environment Agency have submitted the flood risk assessment submitted by the Newton Residents Association and have stated that the site is not at risk of tidal or fluvial flooding. As the site is not at risk of tidal or fluvial flooding on the Environment Agency's flood map, and they have no evidence that the development will exacerbate flood risk off-site, they have no grounds on which to object to a development where a flood risk assessment is not required to be submitted. The application proposes discharge of surface water to a soakaway, which is a French drain, backfilled with stones, so it will store the excess rainwater within the stones at the bottom. Over time, this water will then drain into the surrounding ground, preventing the risk of floods occurring or the ground becoming waterlogged. As such, the scheme is not considered to present or be an unacceptable risk of flooding. In terms of foul drainage, the applicant is proposing to discharge foul drainage to a private treatment plant. The Newton Residents Association have submitted a preliminary assessment of the proposed sewage treatment facility, which recommends that a foul drainage assessment needs to be completed prior to planning approval being granted. Circular 399 recommends that local planning authorities should also consider whether it's appropriate to condition an application to address concerns regarding foul drainage in a practicable and sustainable manner before refusing an application on these grounds. The Environment Agency have stated that they are satisfied that if the Council condition the scheme for foul drainage as they recommend, in the event that the applicant cannot demonstrate a packaged treatment plant is an effective solution in this location, the condition will not be able to be discharged, and an alternative method of foul disposal will need to be identified before development can be commenced. The installation of a packaged treatment plant would require approval under the building regulations, and any discharge of sewage or trade effluent made to either surface water or groundwater will need to be registered as an exempt discharge activity or hold an environmental permit issued by the Environment Agency. So drainage issues can therefore be satisfactorily addressed by ensuring the development can be commenced in accordance with an approved scheme. With regard to the issue of contaminated land, the Newton Residents Association have submitted a report by Ford Consultants which assesses the level of contamination. The applicant has also submitted a Phase 1 environmental audit submitted by Booth Associates. This is an initial survey which identifies the appropriate approach in order to address the contamination issues if planning permission were to be granted. Both reports have been reviewed by the Environment Agency, who in their response of the 15th of August this year suggested the condition which appears as number 12 on your agenda. In terms of ecology, the site consists of existing hard standing, which is considered to be suboptimal habitat for most species. There are no existing buildings on the site, and there are no trees or hedgerows to be removed or pruned. Aside from the discharge of treated water from the packaged sewage treatment plant into a neighbouring ditch, no watercourse would be affected, and there are no ponds within 250 metres of the application area. The county ecologist and Natural England have been consulted and raised no objections. So significant impacts on biodiversity as a result of these proposals seem unlikely, and the application is considered to be in accordance with the requirements of biodiversity legislation, planning policy and guidance. So the application is recommended for approval by your officers for these reasons. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, there's been a request from the Secretary of State that if the Council is minded to approve the application, that it be called in for his request.
Thank you, Mr. Atherton. Councillor Speak.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a few questions I'd like to ask, and at the end of any questions asked, can I please come back with a summary and a recommendation? Thank you. First question is, condition number 2. If this site is not considered appropriate for a residential caravan park or holiday caravan park, why is it considered appropriate for a Gypsy caravan park site?
Sorry, I'll do them one at a time, Chairman, otherwise if we get to the end of the list, I'll probably forget what the first one was. Yeah, the basic answer to that question is that holiday and residential caravan sites are considered against different policies in the local plan. So there are a different set of criteria which will be considered. So those types of accommodation in terms of residential caravans will be considered against the housing policies, because there's no difference from a housing site to a residential caravan site. And in regards to holiday homes, will be considered against Trek 6 and 7 of the local plan. So there are different criteria to be applied. They have different characteristics in regard to things like people not necessarily knowing, for a holiday caravan site, for example, not knowing where the site is, not knowing the local road conditions, etc. So that's the reason there. There is a suggested amendment to the reason on the late observations schedule as well.
Thank you, Chairman. It sounds nonsense, that, really, because people are living in caravans regardless of who they are, whether they're holiday makers or gypsies or travellers. My second question is about conditions that are to be imposed if planning permission is granted. How will the planning department ensure the applicant fully meets the requirements set out, and how will the planning department ensure that it will have the necessary transparency to reassure residents and regulatory bodies that the conditions have been followed?
Thank you, Chairman. There's a statutory procedure for the discharge of planning conditions. An application has to be made to the local planning authority to discharge those conditions. If those conditions require input from external bodies, we would send those the submitted details to them and obtain their responses. So there is an established procedure for doing that. And then obviously, if there are any issues with the details submitted, then obviously we would go back to the applicant to seek to address those issues.
Thank you. And my final question for now, Chairman, is why has there been no reference in the report to the impact on recreational amenity within the village, the bridleway and public footpath, The site access track is part of a bridle way, the Millennium Way, and it's well used, frequently used by local walkers, joggers and horse riders, but there's no reference in the report to the impact of this, what this development would have on those amenities. Can I ask why not?
From my recollection, there is, Chairman. I'm just trying to find it at the moment.
At the bottom of page 28, states the bridle network links into Thames Street and Grange Lane. There's car parking provision proposed on site, and there's no evidence that the highway network would be obstructed.
Is that it? I'm sorry, but it's used, the amenity is used by so many different groups of people on Thames Street, and in just one sentence that's supposed to cover it all. Is that it?
Chairman, there's also reference to the general visual amenity impact on page 29 that addresses that wider aspect. So I'm sorry, but the issue is covered in the report. If you come to different conclusions about the impacts of that effects of that impact, then so be it. But they are covered there, I'm afraid.
Thank you. If I can come back later, Chairman, please.
Councillor Oates.
I've got quite a number of questions, Chairman, but can I just follow up on one of Heather's? I just wonder, do we have a policy in place setting out how we deal with enforcement? Because our track record is quite poor on dealing with enforcement, and I would like to know if we do have a policy in place.
Yes, we do have an enforcement protocol. Primarily, I say the first port of call will be in terms of discharge of conditions if planning permission were to be granted. There is a requirement for the applicant to submit details. If they do not do that, then that gives them a risk of being in breach of planning legislation. The second thing is that if something subsequently is occurring that shouldn't do, then we obviously have a procedure in place where people can advise us of any potential breaches, and we investigate those in line with an agreed timeframe.
Can I carry on with my questions, please, Chairman? Circular 1195 states that authorities should ask themselves whether planning permission would have to be refused if the requirements of that condition were not imposed. There's doubt that many of the conditions can be successfully imposed. For instance, the acceptable sewage and drainage, or the road safety and land contamination. Does the Planning Office have a robust plan on how to impose these conditions? If not in accordance with Circular 1195, shouldn't the application be refused?
Chairman, thank you. Well, first of all, the entire report, including the conditions, has been the subject of review by Council. The Council took that opinion. His opinion is that the conditions as set out on the agenda paper are in compliance with Circular 1195. So that's the starting point. The conditions have also been notified to the applicant, and they have not raised any issue with the proposed conditions. They've seen the report when it was published last week, and so there's not been any issue raised there. So I have no reason to doubt that any of those conditions would render the site unviable. In terms of the particular question that was raised in regard to the Environment Agency's suggested condition, I specifically raised the issue with our barrister in regard to whether that was actually, as has been suggested, granting permission with one hand and taking it away with the other, being an unimplementable condition. He was satisfied that the terms of the condition met with the guidance in Circular 1195, and it was an appropriate condition. If that condition requires the information to be submitted up front, and it requires the development to be carried out in accordance with those approved details. If it is not possible to get those details agreed, then they would not be able to proceed with the development, or they would have to come up with an alternative means. Like I say, that specific issue has been specifically raised with our barrister, and he is satisfied that that condition does meet the tests.
Can I just come back on that one? I wonder, have the applicant seen the late observation schedule and the latest conditions on there?
No, they want to see that one, Chairman.
So we don't know whether they agree to some of the things in there, particularly the highways comments.
I can say that I wouldn't expect them to.
Chairman, obviously those have only been published today, so they haven't had a chance to see those, so we don't know what their response is. At the end of the day, conditions are there to be imposed by the local planning authority, not to negotiate them.
Sorry, I came back on that because you said that they'd agreed to all the conditions, so I wanted to make sure they'd seen them all.
Chairman, just to clarify, they've not agreed to them, they've just not raised any issue with them.
Circular 1195 also states that conditions have to be enforceable. How enforceable is the length of the caravan, the weight of the vehicle, and the number of residents using the package treatment plant? And how would you actually enforce those particular conditions?
I'm afraid my answer might seem flippant, and I don't mean it in this way anyway at all, but the simple answer is we would measure the caravans. If they are more than 23 feet long, they will be in breach of the condition. In regard to, so like I said, it seems obvious, but I mean, I don't mean that with any disrespect. The other side of it is obviously in the number of people. Then we would, you know, if there were reports that there were more people than expected living there, then we would take that up. Obviously, we can again count the number of people that are on site. We generally rely on people reporting issues of that nature to us, and then we would, because it's part of the community involvement in the planning process.
That's why I asked the question, just to make sure that people are aware that it's up to them to report any breaches if they feel that there are any. My next question is about flooding, and information's been shared which clearly identifies that flood zones 2 and 3 directly adjacent to the site. We've got photographic evidence which confirms extensive surface water flooding of the site and access roads. Considering that the risk of flooding is real and evident, would it not be sensible to have completed a site-specific flood risk assessment prior to a decision being made on this application?
Chairman, I've got to say that I've not seen any evidence of the site flooding. I've seen evidence of the... I've seen evidence of the road coming up to the site flooding. I've seen evidence of standing water on the site. That's different to flooding. The bottom line is that we consulted with the Environment Agency. They have provided us with their comments. They have not requested any additional studies or work. I think we've got to say that the guidance says if it's in those zones 2 and 3, then we've got a situation whereby we would ask for additional information, but it's outside those zones, so it's in accordance with the guidance. And the statutory agency that might express those concerns have not expressed that concern.
Sewage and drainage. If, as claimed by the NRA, experts in this field, that discharge to local dikes via drains can't meet guidelines, that there's no mechanism allowable under building regulations to discharge onto site, and Grange Lane's main sewers are overloaded and unavailable, and that's according to United Utilities, how can conditions 10 and 11 be met? Would it not be sensible to do as the NRA expert requests and get a file drainage assessment completed prior to the application?
Well, once again, we are acting on the guidance of the statutory agency responsible for protecting those two particular issues, foul drainage and the flood risk side of things from the Environment Agency. So United Utilities have provided us with their comments, as have the Environment Agency. If they had sufficient concern that this proposal would adversely affect the areas that they're statutorily responsible for, they would have recommended that the application be refused, but they have not done so, and therefore we have to act upon their advice. We have put those conditions on as requested by them, and those have been assessed by a barrister, and as I said earlier, they've been seen to be in accordance with the circular.
Highways and road safety. There are many issues raised relating to highway safety as a consequence of the poor road infrastructure to gain access to this site. All the planning office do is repeat the highways officers that it's not ideal. Do the planning office agree that full consideration of the empirical data has not been factored into the officer's report, and that the full understanding of the highways issues and safety is essential, and that great weight should be given to this concern? To fully understand the highway safety issues, the Highways Authority requested a track analysis for this application, should this have been completed before a decision is made. And to cover all highway safety issues, does the planning office agree that any track analysis should include site and off-site parking requirements and the needs of other users, and that it should be completed before making this decision?
Chairman, we've specifically requested that the County Highway Authority confirm that they have reviewed the information contained in the Sanderson's report. They have confirmed that they have done so. The late observation schedule confirms that in terms of tracking, etc., that they are satisfied that there will be no adverse impact. I think in terms of parking on the highway, I think their standard response will be that highways are for passing along and not parking upon. So we have a situation where they have been asked on a number of occasions, are you satisfied that you have fully assessed these issues? And they've come back to us and said yes. In terms of what your planning officers think about that, I've got to say that it's my professional opinion that the establishment of a small caravan site for Gypsy families in this location would not have an adverse impact, and that's just my opinion. So that's the those points have been pushed with the Highway Authority. They have provided 2 additional responses, which are on the late observation schedule, to confirm that their position. They have confirmed that they would not wish to defend an appeal if planning permission was refused on highways grounds. They have proposed conditions, the imposition of conditions.
So if, as a result of this application, we find that there are vehicles parked out on the roadways and plant and machinery, it wouldn't be enforceable, would it, because there are no restrictions on those roadways?
Chairman, in terms of planning conditions, they can only relate to the site, so we couldn't impose a planning condition that relates to the surrounding area. As I observed this morning, there are no weighting restrictions that I saw on the roads, but that's not to say that you can park there. If you park there and obstruct a highway, then you're causing an offence, as I understand it, under the Highways Act.
Can I say now that the police rarely come out because they always say that now parking's been decriminalised, it's no longer their job to do it, and if in the rural Fylde you can find a parking attendant, you do very well because they're like hen's teeth. Come back later, Chairman. I have some other questions, but I thought I'd let somebody else have a go.
Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Chairman. Site design. We've heard from one of the speakers that the layout that's been shown to us is not to scale. In fact, it looks like it's been done on the back of a fag packet. The regulations and conditions within Government Circular 1195/03/99 or the DCLG Designing Gypsy and Traveller Sites Good Practice Guide will make it impossible to accommodate 4 pitches or 8 caravans on this site. Is this not a material consideration that cannot be met?
It's a material consideration. That's correct. We consider that it is met.
Has a scale layout of the site been provided?
Yeah, if you look on the screen there, there's a layout there, scale 1 to 500. So
there are concerns about the scale. Moving on, we have not got a local plan in place. We will be looking at the issues of the provision of traveller sites. What work has the LDF yet to do with regard to traveller sites, gypsy sites?
just to clarify, there is a development plan in place. It's the safe policies of the Fylde local plan, and we're obviously relying on policy HL8 in assessing this application. The preferred option will replace that document in due time. As part of that work, we have commissioned a Gypsy traveller and accommodation assessment to replace the 2007 assessment that showed the 0.58 pitch requirement for the Fylde borough. That work has been commissioned jointly with Blackpool and Wyre and is expected to report in March of 2014.
Will part of the work that has to be done by the LDF committee be looking to identify any sites, suitable sites within the borough?
The local plan is proposed to be dealt with in two parts. The first part will look at the larger strategic site, and the second part will include identification of smaller sites. So it will be the Part 2 document, which will follow on from the Part 1 document that will identify sites such as gypsy and traveller sites.
Is it not quite possible that a far better site for travellers, gypsies, could be found within the borough? The presentation we had last year made it quite clear that we shouldn't just be putting gypsies anywhere, we should be finding good sites for them. And I don't feel that this is a particularly good site, and the portfolio holder has been reported in the press as saying that developers should not preempt what's in the local plan and wait until it's in place. I mean, that's aspirational. I don't think they will do that. But I feel like with this, we're just saying, yes, there is a need, a greater need in Blackpool, Fylde and Wyre. But surely we're jumping the gun by saying, yes, we're going to meet that need with this site.
I suppose the first point there is that the part of assessing a planning application is not to say that there are better or more appropriate sites available. Either this site is acceptable or it's not. So that's the assessment that we have to take account of here. The officer recommendation is that this is an acceptable site, having taken into account the various policies. In terms of prematurity, guidance on that is still contained in some guidance that was published to support the former Planning Policy Statement 1, the Planning System General Principles. That deals with prematurity as a reason for refusing planning permission. And it says that guidance is that on its own, prematurity is not a sufficient reason to refuse planning permission. We have to continue to determine applications despite the fact that a plan is emerging. It is not considered appropriate by government that local authorities stop dealing with applications pending the adoption of a future or emerging development plan.
Councillor Redcliffe.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got three brief questions, but I'd like to preface those questions by simply saying that regardless of the outcome of today's deliberations, could I take the opportunity of commending the Residents' Association for their clear and concise and very disciplined presentations, and for the massive portfolio of information that was personally delivered to my house. I spent many happy hours reading. my first question is relating to, there's a reference, because we're looking, aren't we, here at a development, and we're trying to come to a judgment and measure the impact that it is going to have on the local community. And that's what we're trying to do. There's a reference to movement, because obviously these are touring caravans, not static caravans. And there's a phrase which is used, several movements a year. Now, it may not be possible to be more precise than that, but my question is, on the basis of experience with other sites elsewhere, which might be of similar scale, is it possible to assess the number of movements, the intensity of movements? And furthermore, being able to assess those movements, are we able to monitor them or control them by condition in any way? Because this is obviously a concern.
Chairman, the normal assessment method for any development is to use what they call the TRICS database, which is basically studies of various sites and the traffic generation that comes from them, and that gives an average for that type of development, and it allows an assessment of the likely impact. In terms of Gypsy and traveller sites, the database doesn't contain that many assessments, and therefore its evidence has been questioned by the consultants, the highways consultants working on behalf of the NRA. The general level of traffic generation from a residential property is in the region of 24 movements a year, of this, sorry, 4 units, will be in the region of 24 movements a day. That has, Sanderson's did some work for the council at the Fairfield Road site, and they showed that the movements at that site, the actual movements at that site, if you factored them down to a site of this size, would equate to about 30 movements a day. That is just a tool for assessing the impact. It's not possible to impose a condition to say there shall only be 30 movements and that the 31st movement would be prohibited or anything of that nature. It is simply a tool. On some days there might be more, on some days there might be less, but it's just an assessment tool.
My second question is, to some extent it's dealt with in one of the conditions, condition 7, and it seems to me the lighting, external lighting of a site of this kind could have a detrimental impact on a local community, depending on the intensity of that lighting, dependent on the placement, you know, how the lights are shining, whether they're shining down, across, up, bearing in mind that the major impact would be for properties looking down on this. So again, it's just a little bit of clarification here. Would this be strictly controlled?
That's the reason, through you, Chairman, for putting that condition on there. It is actually permitted development as part of a caravan site licence to install lighting without needing planning permission. So we have put that condition on there and said, notwithstanding those provisions, they would need to come to the local planning authority to seek approval. The type of thing that we would look at is things like the height of the lighting columns, the nature of the lighting heads, light spill, that type of thing. So what we would expect to see is a relatively subdued lighting scheme in that type of location, a rural location. We wouldn't be looking at a scheme of sort of 500 watt halogen floodlights or something of that nature that you might find on certain more commercial sites perhaps.
And finally and briefly, one of the concerns is clearly that if this site was to be approved and it was operational, it would have an impact in terms of visual amenity. And I'm interested in the condition 8, I think, regarding landscaping. Would screening, visual screening, and also screening in terms of sound and controlling and limiting the amount of noise pollution be a consideration in that condition?
Yes, in terms of screening, the guidance again in the design guidance for Gypsy and traveller sites, that speaks against having sites that are almost like completely contained. with, so they're not part of the local community. The guidance is that they should be seen as being part of the local community. So the landscaping would not necessarily be to screen the development so you wouldn't know it was there. It will be to soften the appearance of the site and provide some, as I say, some softening of the harsh edges, buildings, caravans, etc. So I think in regard to the properties across the road, for example, you can see that there are buildings there. You can see through the hedgerows, but the hedgerow helps and the planting helps to soften that appearance as opposed to completely masking it. So that's the type of approach that would generally be taken on a landscaping scheme.
Councillor Duffy.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of questions, really. I have several concerns about this, but my main one really is the identification of the need. I understand that there's a duty to cooperate, but I just don't want that being... it seems to me at the minute that it's almost been interpreted as taken as a duty to anticipate rather than a duty to cooperate. So my first question really is, what contact has Fylde Borough Council had specifically about this application or about provision of Gypsy traveller sites in general? What contact have we had with Blackpool and or Wyre councils with regard to us providing for some of their need, because we obviously don't have any or very little of our own?
Chairman, as I said earlier, the new Gypsy travel and accommodation assessment is being prepared jointly, so that's the joint commission. So there have been a series of meetings with Blackpool and Wyre and the consultants in regard to that work. So that is an ongoing piece of work, regular meetings. We have also, before that piece of work was commissioned, we also have held joint Gypsy and Traveller liaison meetings with the Gypsy and Traveller community. So there has been a history of working together, particularly with Wyre, more so at that stage, and then Blackpool have come on board with the GTAA, the revised Gypsy Travel Accommodation Assessment. We have specifically asked them about the recent approvals in regard to recent planning permissions granted for Gypsy and Traveller pitches in their areas, to supplement our knowledge about recent, or the lack of recent approvals in Fylde. So there has been that cooperation. The stance that is taken in the report is very much based upon the view that was supported by the Secretary of State. He supported his planning inspector at Fairfield Road in regards to the need and how you should take account of the wider need. That is not just the view of his inspector, it's the view of the Secretary of State. And he concluded in that report that it was a significant material consideration weighing in the appellant's favour at Fairfield Road. I think as a council, we ran the line that we only had a 0.58 pitch need in Fylde, and that we'd approved 6 Gypsy caravan pitches since that need was assessed, and therefore it had been met. That was not a line supported by the inspector or the Secretary of State, and so that is a clear indication of how the Secretary of State is expecting need to be assessed, in my opinion.